Zhou Xian's fingers brushed against the cool, black lens of her camera as she crouched in front of her subject. It was a routine job, one of those that didn't require any deep thought, just a series of mechanical clicks and a patient smile as she worked her way through the standard set of poses. The woman in front of her was dressed in a red dress that clashed against the cold, industrial gray of the backdrop. A part of Xian's mind wandered, distracted by the lines and light, the endless symmetry of it all. There was something hollow about it. Perfect, Xian murmured, the word leaving her lips like a command as she snapped another photo. The lens clicked and flashed, momentarily blinding her. She frowned, looking at the digital display on the back of her camera. The model's face was wrong. The woman was smiling in the shot, but the smile was twisted, elongated, stretched almost unnaturally, as though the image itself had taken on a life of its own. Xian blinked, checked her settings. Everything was as it should be. No filters, no glitches, just light and shadow. But the distortion was there, clear as day. I think I've seen enough, the model said, her voice cold and slightly amused, as though this were all a performance. Xian glanced up. The woman's lips weren't moving anymore, but the voice was still there, as though it was emanating directly from her image. Excuse me? Xian said, her heart skipping a beat. She could feel a bead of sweat trickle down the back of her neck. You think that's what I look like? The model's voice was deeper now, more menacing. It was no longer just a sound, it felt like a presence, like something else was inside the room with them. The model's smile widened in an exaggerated way, but the eyes were something else entirely. They were dark, empty pits, blacker than the backdrop, and they seemed to be staring straight into Xian's soul. Xian snapped her gaze to the camera, but when she looked back, the model was gone. The studio door was locked, the window was still intact. She had seen it with her own eyes, and yet it didn't make sense. Shit, Xian muttered under her breath. She turned to the security feed on her tablet, scanning the footage of the studio from every angle. The woman, her subject, was nowhere to be found. A sudden ring of her phone broke the eerie silence. Xian jumped, startled. The screen displayed the name of her old mentor, Li Jun. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. Xian, you need to listen carefully. Li Jun's voice crackled through the line, filled with urgency. You've just seen something. Something dangerous. Something you're not ready for. I don't know what the hell I saw, Li. But it wasn't real, Xian said, trying to brush it off. That's the thing, he continued, his voice now lowering to a whisper. It's all real. The light can be controlled. If you don't understand that, you're going to be in deep trouble. The people you're dealing with, they don't just manipulate images, they manipulate the world itself. Stay away from them. Trust me, Xian, run, now. The line went dead before Xian could respond. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Was it a prank? No. Li Jun wasn't the type to joke, especially about something like this. She'd seen the way his eyes had changed when they'd last spoken about the nature of photography, the way the line between what could be captured and what could be created had blurred for him years ago. Maybe he had been trying to warn her all along, but how could she leave? How could she run when she had barely even begun to understand the power in her own hands? It wasn't long before Xian realized she couldn't escape her new reality. The next few days were a blur, filled with strange occurrences. She found herself seeing things through a new lens, quite literally. Everything seemed sharper, brighter, more malleable. On her morning commute, the world around her felt different. She walked down the crowded streets, the light bouncing off the glass buildings, yet the shadows didn't look quite right. They stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that made her dizzy. It was when she passed a street vendor's stall, trying to get some fresh air, that it hit her. As she reached for her phone to check the time, she noticed something in the reflection of the glass, a man standing behind her. His face was unnervingly familiar, though she couldn't place him. His eyes glinted like two pools of black ink, and he was grinning in a way that made her skin crawl. She spun around, but the man was gone. She was alone in the crowd. The next day, she finally decided to test the limits of what she had experienced, armed with nothing more than her camera and a growing sense of dread. She went back to her studio and set up another shot, this time with no model, just her camera and a small object she had found in the street, a crumpled receipt. She set the camera's settings low and adjusted the aperture carefully, just the way she would for any long exposure shot. The world around her felt strangely still as she peered through the viewfinder. Her fingers tightened on the shutter button. She clicked. The world blinked, the receipt in her hand transformed. The light around it bent and contorted, spiraling in ways it shouldn't. When she opened her eyes, it was no longer a simple scrap of paper. The receipt had been replaced by a glowing, holographic image of her own face, frozen in an exaggerated, ghoulish smile. Xian's heart raced. She stepped back, fumbling to turn off the camera, but it was too late. The lights overhead flickered once and then went dark, plunging her into complete blackness. A cold breath slid down her neck, and a voice, echoing from the shadows, whispered, "You're ours now." In that moment, she understood. The camera wasn't just a tool for capturing light. It was a conduit. A way for something else to enter her world. And once you were connected, there was no going back. That night, Xian received a message, this time from an unknown number. The text was short, but the message was clear: "You have something we want." She didn't know what to make of it. At first, it seemed like a threat. But the more she thought about it, the more the words twisted into something else, something darker. She wasn't just being hunted. She was being chosen. With nowhere else to turn, she met with Li Jun the following evening, in a dimly lit cafe on the edge of the city. "You have no idea how deep this goes," he said, his voice tight with fear. "The people you've encountered, they're called the shifters. They're criminals, yes, but they're also something more. They use light to control people's perception, manipulate their realities, and erase their memories. To them, you're not just a photographer. You're the key." Xian frowned. "The key to what?" "To everything." Li Jun's hands trembled as he clasped them together, leaning in closer. "They've been watching you, Xian. Watching your ability to control light. You're not like other photographers. You've tapped into something beyond the frame, something powerful." "Then what? Why didn't you tell me this before?" Her voice grew sharp, a bitter edge to it. She had trusted him, but now, she wasn't sure where his loyalties lay. "I wanted to, but it's not safe," he replied, shaking his head. "They've been manipulating people for years, using the power of perception to get what they want: money, power, influence. And now they want you. They think you can help them finish what they started." Xian stared at the table, letting the weight of his words sink in. She felt like she was on the edge of something terrible, something far beyond her understanding. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Li Jun met her gaze. "You fight back, Xian. You have to learn to control your power, or you'll lose everything. And when you do, you'll become more than just a photographer, you'll become the only thing that can stop them." But the truth was, Xian wasn't sure if she could control anything anymore. Xian didn't sleep that night. In fact, she barely moved. She sat on the edge of her bed, her camera resting on the table in front of her, the hum of the city outside serving as a dull soundtrack to her thoughts. What had Li Jun meant when he said she was the key? The key to what? And why? Was it just because of her ability to manipulate light, or was there something else? Her fingers traced the edges of her camera, the one simple object now pulsing with an energy she couldn't explain. She stood abruptly, her pulse quickening. Maybe she could test it again, this power she barely understood. She grabbed the camera and stepped into the bathroom, flicking on the light. The reflection in the mirror greeted her, just her. Or was it? She squinted, trying to focus. For a split second, the reflection didn't match her exact movements, as though it was a moment behind or out of sync. Her heart skipped. No. Focus, she steadied her breath and lifted the camera, the lens almost feeling like an extension of her body. She adjusted the aperture and clicked the shutter, the light flickered. In the reflection, her face, her own face, was different. The features were exaggerated, grotesque, like something out of a nightmare. Her mouth stretched wide, her eyes darkened into two pools of shadow. The smile was there again, but this time it felt wrong, almost like an invitation. Xian blinked, and the reflection returned to normal, but the pulse of unease in her chest remained. Focus, she whispered to herself. Control it. But it wasn't control she was looking for. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand why this was happening, why her life had turned into some bizarre, distorted version of reality. She lowered the camera, its weight suddenly feeling heavier in her hands. She didn't know how much longer she could go on like this, jumping at shadows, chasing things she couldn't quite grasp. But there was no turning back. The longer she ignored it, the deeper the darkness seemed to creep into her life. The next morning, Xian woke early, the day unfolding in the hazy gray light of dawn. She knew what she had to do. Li Jun had given her some direction, but he hadn't told her the full story. And now, she needed to find out the truth on her own. The city was waking up slowly, its streets still wet from an early morning rain. She walked briskly through the busy sidewalks, not noticing how her steps seemed to fall in perfect rhythm with the traffic and the hum of voices. The light around her, the shadows, the flicker of headlights, it all felt like a dream now, an image half-formed. Her first stop was her old photography studio, the place where everything had changed. The windows were dusty, the door unlocked. She hadn't been here in days, but it felt like years. She stepped inside, the faint smell of old paper and chemicals hanging in the air. The equipment was all in place, but the silence felt suffocating. Xian set her camera down on the table. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She'd been here hundreds of times before, but today felt different. It was as if the walls themselves were watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She turned on the lights, adjusting the bulbs one by one, as if rearranging reality itself. The flicker from the lights seemed stronger now, almost deliberate. She squinted at the camera's lens. The darkness outside, the shadows at the corners of the room, they all seemed to stretch toward her, like they had a life of their own. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, the heavy sound echoing through the studio. "Welcome back, Xian." The voice was unmistakable. She spun around, and there, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Guo, the man she had encountered briefly the day before. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with an unsettling light. "You've been expecting me?" Xian's voice was flat, more out of instinct than surprise. She had learned quickly that there was no point in pretending anymore. Not with him. Not with anyone that Amar. Guo smiled, though there was no warmth to it. Not expecting. Anticipating. There's a difference. You see, you're very special, Zhou Xian. We've been watching you for some time now. You've been chosen. Chosen for what you can do. She couldn't stop herself from taking a step back, the camera in her hand suddenly feeling like a heavy weapon. "You're the ones behind all this, aren't you?" "Not all of it," he replied, his voice smooth, like syrup. "But we've had our share of influence, yes. We work in the shadows, Xian. We are the shifters." Xian's chest tightened. "The director," she muttered. "He's the one who runs things. Where is he?" Mr. Guo raised an eyebrow, his smile never faltering. "The director is preoccupied. But don't worry, he knows all about you. In fact, he's waiting for you to come to him. But I don't think you'll make it that far." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you want from me?" "Want? You make it sound like a transaction." He stepped forward, the shadows around him seemingly bending, shifting. "What we want is simple, we want you to join us. To see things as we see them. To control light, manipulate perception, and, ultimately, control the world. Not going to happen, Xian spat, her voice harder now. I'm not some pawn in your game. He chuckled, a low, amused sound that sent chills down her spine. No, Xian. You're not a pawn. You're the queen. Before she could react, the lights above them flickered again, this time more violently. The shadows on the walls seemed to warp, stretching like tendrils reaching for her. She raised her camera instinctively, the lens catching the distorted light. The shadows on the walls multiplied, splitting, twisting, shifting into grotesque shapes, filling every corner of the room. It was like the very fabric of reality was coming undone, unraveling before her eyes. Xian's breath caught in her throat. She felt the pressure in the room, the weight of something ancient and hungry. And then, through the chaos, she heard it, an image, a whisper, forming in her mind, the director. She was standing at the edge of a cliff. She didn't know how she had gotten there, but she could see him clearly now, the director, his face bathed in blinding light, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her knees buckle. He spoke, but it wasn't with words. It was with light, with energy, with an overwhelming force that shattered her thoughts. She shook her head, the vision fading as quickly as it came, and refocused on Mr. Gua. I'm not joining you. Ever. He sighed, the smile on his lips tight. I had hoped you'd see reason, but I suppose you're too stubborn for that. His fingers twitched, and the lights flickered one last time. Then, a deafening silence fell over the room. For a moment, Xian thought she had won. But then she saw it, the shadows in the corner of the studio. They were moving, crawling toward her like sentient creatures. Her camera, her weapon, wasn't going to help her. Not against this, you're going to regret this, Mr. Gua said softly, his voice like a promise. You have no idea how deep this goes. But you will. Soon enough. Xian backed up slowly, eyes darting toward the door. But before she could make a move, the shadows in the room pulsed again, and a cold hand gripped her wrist. Her breath hitched as she was pulled forward, and she felt a pressure at the back of her skull, a darkness pushing at the edges of her mind. She blinked hard, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the pressure lifted. The room was still. The shadows still, unmoving. She wrenched herself free and bolted for the door, but before she could reach it, the lights dimmed once more, and everything went black. The world came back in fragments. Xian gasped as she stumbled into darkness, her breath ragged. The room around her was a blur, shadows twisting in every direction. She could feel the weight of something, someone, bearing down on her. It wasn't just the shadows. It was the air itself, thick and suffocating, as though the very fabric of reality had been twisted by unseen hands. The light had gone out completely, and she was left standing in the oppressive silence, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, she felt the sharp sting of panic, the kind that makes your pulse race and your mind freeze. But then she remembered, the camera. It was all she had left. She fumbled in the dark, her fingers brushing over the familiar cold metal of the lens. There was no time to think. She raised the camera to her eye, adjusting the focus with trembling hands. She couldn't hear anything except her own rapid breathing, the sense of something lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. Her finger pressed the shutter button. The flash was instantaneous, blinding. It sliced through the blackness like a sword of light, cutting through the shadows. She blinked, trying to clear the afterimage from her eyes, and when she opened them again, the world had changed. The shadows on the walls seemed to dissipate, their forms broken apart by the sharp burst of light. They didn't vanish completely, nothing ever did, but they had been momentarily scattered, weakened. Xian took another step forward, feeling her way through the darkness, now more familiar than frightening. She didn't know where the light had gone, but it didn't matter. She had found a way to fight back. Her heart still racing, she quickly snapped a few more shots into the thick of the room, trying to reassert some kind of control. The camera's flash went off, lighting up the studio again, this time with more force. But there was no sound. No reaction. The shadows remained stubbornly present, creeping back into the corners, reasserting their dominance. She cursed under her breath. It wasn't enough. The flash had given her a brief reprieve, but it wasn't a solution. The dark, oppressive presence she had felt when she first entered the room hadn't gone anywhere. It was still here. Watching her, then, she heard it, a faint whisper, a soft scrape of something against the floor. Xian spun, camera raised, ready to fire. But it wasn't Mr. Gua. It wasn't the shadows either. She blinked in surprise. Standing in front of her was a figure, a man, tall, dressed in a suit that shimmered with an almost surreal intensity. The light in the room flickered again, and for a moment, it seemed to be bending toward him, as though he were absorbing it, feeding off it. His face was pale, expressionless, but his eyes gleamed with that same cold, calculating awareness that Mr. Gua had shown her. "Are you the director?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. He didn't respond at first. Instead, he studied her, his gaze measuring, piercing. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and unsettling. "You've done well to make it this far, Zhou Xian," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "Not many can hold their ground against what we are. But you will have to do more than fight if you want to survive this." Xian's fingers tightened around the camera. "What do you want from me?" "I'm not joining you." The director smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made Xian's skin crawl. He stepped closer, and she instinctively raised the camera to her eye again. "You misunderstand, Xian," he said, almost patiently. "You already are one of us." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She took a half step back, her mind racing. "I don't understand," she whispered. You can't be serious." "I'm not like you. I'm not one of the shifters." He chuckled, his voice dark. "You say that now. But you are one of us, whether you accept it or not. You've been manipulating light from the very beginning. All we've done is push you to see it for what it truly is." Xian shook her head, trying to clear the fog that was descending on her mind. "You're lying. I didn't choose this. I didn't ask for any of this." The director's smile remained, but it was a sad, knowing thing. "None of us choose our destiny. We only choose whether or not to embrace it." He gestured toward the camera in her hands. "That device, your tool, it is not just a camera. It is an instrument of power, Xian. A way to bend the very essence of light. You are already walking the path you were meant to walk." The words hit her with a weight she couldn't ignore. The truth of them echoed in the back of her mind. She had always been able to manipulate light, to create illusions, to shape what people saw. But she had never understood the full scope of it. She had thought it was just her skill, something she had learned through experience and intuition. But now, the director's words were unspooling a truth she wasn't ready to face. Xian took another step back, her body trembling. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said, as if the answer were obvious. "We want you to understand your power. We want you to see what you could become if you embrace it. We are the shifters, and together, we can reshape the world. With your help, we can make reality bend to our will. You can lead this revolution. You can be the one to bring about the change that's been waiting for millennia." She shook her head, her mind spinning. The world around her felt like it was folding in on itself, the shadows dancing, the light bending to the will of the man before her. The weight of his words pressed on her chest like a physical force. He was offering her power, unimaginable power. But at what cost? And what did it mean to embrace this kind of power? Xian knew she couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust anyone who thought they had the right to shape the world with nothing but illusions. But what if the truth was darker than she could imagine? "What if I refuse?" Xian asked, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. The director tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then you will face the consequences. We are not merciful with those who stand in our way. But I see you, Xian. I see your potential. The question is, do you see it in yourself? Xian didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lifted the camera again. The light flashed, bright and blinding, flooding the room with the power of her will. The director flinched, as though the light had struck him physically. For a moment, his features flickered, warping and distorting, as if he were just another illusion, a projection in the dark. But when the flash faded, he was still there, his expression unchanging, even a little amused. Impressive, he said, his voice soft. But that is only a glimpse of what you could do. With the right guidance, you could control much more than just light. You could control everything. Xian stepped back, gripping the camera harder. She didn't know what this power was, or how deep it ran, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let the director, or the shifters, control her. She didn't know if she had the strength to stop them, but she wasn't about to let them win. I'm not afraid of you, she said, the words coming out louder than she expected, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. The director's eyes flashed with something unreadable. We shall see. With a single, fluid motion, he turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the shadows. For a moment, Xian just stood there, trying to steady her breath. The weight of everything he had said was pressing on her, but she knew she couldn't dwell on it now. She had to act. She had to stop the shifters before they could destroy everything. With the camera in hand, Xian took one last look around the studio. The shadows had started to return, creeping back into the corners of the room, but they didn't seem as threatening now. They were just shapes, fleeting things, like the light itself, transient and ever-changing. She wasn't going to let them control her. Not today. Not ever. Xian stepped toward the door, her eyes set with resolve. There was no turning back now, and as she left the studio, stepping out into the uncertain light of dawn, she knew one thing: this wasn't just about light or shadows anymore. This was about her. And she wasn't about to let them take that away. Xian walked through the quiet, damp streets of the city, the gray morning light barely piercing through the thick clouds above. The weight of the camera in her hand felt reassuring, though it seemed almost too heavy now. The streets, so familiar just hours ago, felt foreign to her, like a world she no longer belonged to. The flash of light, the shadows, the director's chilling words, they all twisted around in her mind, refusing to let go. She could still feel the sting of the camera's flash against the darkness, the way it had momentarily pushed back the suffocating pressure in the room, but it hadn't been enough. None of it had been enough. The city had never felt more oppressive. Everywhere she looked, the buildings seemed to loom over her, their steel and glass facades cold and indifferent. The shadows cast by the morning light stretched long, swallowing up the pavement, but they felt alive now, almost as if they were waiting for her to make a misstep. She had no idea where she was going, no plan, no clear path forward, but the urge to get away from the studio, away from the director, was overwhelming. The night's encounter had left her shaken. But it also left her with something else. Determination. She had to stop the shifters. Whatever they were planning, whatever they had done to her, it had to be stopped before it was too late. There was no question anymore. She wasn't going to let them take control of her, or of the city, or of the world they seemed to think they could twist to their will. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out without thinking and saw the message from an unknown number: "Come to the old theater. We need to talk." No name, no context, just an address. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. The message was strange, but it felt like it might be important. Maybe even the break she was looking for. Xian glanced at the sky, now overcast with low-hanging clouds, and made a decision. She wasn't going to waste time wondering who had sent the message. She was going to find out what it meant. The old theater was a relic, tucked away in a forgotten part of the city. It hadn't shown a movie in years. Most people didn't even remember it existed. The building had always been a little eerie. Overgrown ivy crept up its crumbling walls, its once grand marquee now faded and peeling. It was the kind of place you'd walk past without a second thought, unless you were looking for something out of the ordinary. Xian found herself walking faster now, her mind already starting to race ahead. Could this be another trap? Was it another move by the shifters? Or was it something else entirely, someone who could help her? The streets were still empty as she approached the theater, the city around her seeming unusually quiet. The doors to the theater were slightly ajar, as though someone had been expecting her. Xian hesitated for only a moment before pushing them open and stepping inside. The theater was dark, the air stale, with a faint smell of dust and mildew. The faint hum of a broken projector somewhere in the back echoed through the empty hall. The seats were covered in plastic sheeting, and a few of the old velvet curtains had long since fallen into tatters. But at the far end of the room, there was a faint glow coming from a small room at the back, light filtering through the cracked door. Xian's pulse quickened. She stepped toward it cautiously, the weight of the camera still pressing in her hands. It felt like everything in the room was holding its breath. As she reached the door, she took a moment to steady herself. No turning back now. She pushed the door open. Inside, the small room was bathed in dim light, but the source wasn't any lamp or bulb. It was coming from an old projector screen at the far side of the room, which displayed a series of shifting images, distorted but sharp. A woman's face flickered on the screen, someone Xian didn't recognize. She was speaking, her voice quiet but urgent. "Xian," the woman said, her lips moving on the screen. "You're the one. You have the power to stop them. You can change everything." Xian's breath caught in her throat. The woman on the screen looked almost familiar, but she couldn't place her. As the images shifted, the woman's face dissolved into a series of cryptic symbols, abstract, distorted shapes, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about them. Xian's instincts flared. This wasn't just a warning. This was a message. It had to be. Suddenly, a voice broke through the static. "You don't have much time," it said. The sound was deep, layered with an unnatural resonance, like a voice speaking through 100 different channels. "The shifters are moving fast. You must understand your power. Only then can you stop them. They have been controlling the light all along, but you are the key to unmaking their control. You must learn to master the light, or they will destroy everything." Xian stared at the screen, heart pounding. Who was this? How did they know what was happening to her? What did they mean, master the light? She had been manipulating the light, yes, but did that mean she had more control than she realized? Could it be that she hadn't even begun to understand the true nature of the power coursing through her? Before she could gather her thoughts, the door to the room slammed shut behind her, startling her. The light in the room flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, then a figure stepped out of the dark, a tall man, his face hidden in shadow. His presence felt strangely familiar, but she couldn't place him either. "You shouldn't have come here, Xian," the man said, his voice calm but ominous. Xian's pulse surged. She raised the camera without thinking, the lens catching the flicker of light in the room, the shadows crawling toward her. "Who are you?" "I'm someone who knows what you're capable of," the man replied. He didn't move closer, but his gaze locked onto hers, as though he could see right through her. "You're stronger than you think. But this isn't the place to learn about it." She stepped back, the camera still trained on him. "What do you want?" "To warn you," he said. "You're walking a dangerous path. The shifters are not what you think. They've been here long before you, pulling the strings, manipulating the light, bending reality. And now they want to bring the world to its knees." Xian's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward her, slowly, his movement deliberate and measured. She could feel the weight of his presence as he closed the distance between them. "I'm the one who can help you stop them," he said, his voice soft. "But you have to trust me. You have to let go of everything you think you know. To fight the shifters, you need to control more than just light. You need to control the illusion itself." Xian's mind reeled. Control the illusion? Was that what he had been talking about, the power of the camera, the way she could manipulate perception, twist what people saw, and what they believed? She hesitated, her grip tightening on the camera. But deep inside, something told her she was running out of time. If she didn't act now, the shifters would take everything. The man stepped closer, his face still obscured by shadows. "You're already a part of this world, Xian. You've been walking on the edge of it for too long to turn back now. But if you don't learn how to truly harness your power, they will destroy you." Xian's breath caught. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? That she was the only one who could stop them? The weight of it settled on her, and for the first time, she felt the full force of what was at stake. The shifters weren't just a group of criminals. They were something far more dangerous, something far more ancient. The camera in her hands, her tool, her weapon, might be the only thing that could stop them. She took a step toward the man, the decision clear in her mind. "I'm ready," she said. The man's eyes glinted with something almost approving, but there was a hint of sadness in them too, as though he knew what it would cost her. "Then let's begin." The lights flickered once more. And in that instant, the shadows in the room seemed to breathe.